Hey guys, thanks for showing up. If you didn't get a chance to watch my introduction video from last week where I told you who I am, how I got into fandoms, and what the agenda is for this show, go ahead and give that one a watch. Today I'd like to introduce to you a book that I wrote. But before we get to the actual reading of the book, I have a couple of other things I'd like to talk about. First, I have some people I'd like to thank for helping me, and I'd also like to tell you a little bit about how I overcame writer's block in coming up with this story. And then I'll tell you a little bit about the book, and then we will read the blurb on the back and the prologue so that you have insight into what you're getting into. First, I have some people to thank. So my father, my dad, Troy, is amazing. He helped me with the whole coming up with this process. He believed in my dreams. He affirmed story elements. We cried together over potential endings to a series I have mapped out, and he was essential to the whole process. So thanks, Dad. The other person I'd like to thank is my good friend Nicole. She just finished editing school and was in the process of doing school when she was editing my book. So with every week that I launched a chapter, Nicole edited all of those chapters ahead of time. She put so much time and effort and energy into working on this for me and with me, and I admire her. I could not have done this without her, and she worked so hard when she did not have the time. So thanks, Nicole. The other thank you is to my followers, my fans who read the book the whole time that I was publishing a chapter at a time. That was a long process, and I appreciate everything that you guys poured into keeping up with it. I appreciate each follow, each read, and I appreciate the people who boosted it for me. I have some really good friends that reposted my posts about it and helped me get more attention for it. So thank you to those people too. I couldn't be here without you. So a little insight into what I had for writer's block. So when I started this, all I had was a concept. I had read posts on Tumblr and Pinterest about villains and the high contrast to heroes. People were talking about the Avengers movies, the Avengers, Iron Man, Thor, and Captain America, and all of these individual movies about heroes saving the day and fighting Loki, who's greatly admired by the fandoms, and Thanos, who is maybe logical, maybe his reasoning for things makes sense, but his methods were really shitty. People just love villains. So with that inspiration in mind, I wanted to write a story where the villains were the main characters, and it came from inspiration like the contrast between villains and heroes in terms of how much they're held accountable for things. Heroes are held to the highest standard. Think of the people that you admire in social media and in real life. If they mess up and don't own up to it, like, there are huge consequences for them from their fans. Just emotional consequences and fame consequences. Whereas villains are expected to be dark and expected to make mistakes and have problems. The other commentary that I loved was that villains get to saunter everywhere. They don't ever have to sprint, they don't ever have to run, and I like that they have the freedom to make their own choices and ways of doing things, whereas heroes have a fairly strict moral code that changes things. The writer's block that I experienced the worst was in the beginning. I had concepts for villains. I had archetypes for 6 villains to be specific, and I kind of started calling them, based on their archetype initially. But what I found to be difficult was naming them. So having a person name for the character outside of their villain self, and a villain name. Those are really hard to come up with in a way that's not cliche and makes sense. So the way that I combated this was I used V1 for villain 1 for my main character, V2, V3, V4, all the way through V6, and I literally wrote the first 8 chapters of my book using V1, V2, V3. I used the word name in place of the name of the love interest of the main character, and I put city name in brackets. It really worked. It helped me a lot to not have to stress about whether or not the person's name would fit the character. I had this emotional sense around the character, and I just wrote them. And when I found a name that fit, I used it, and I tried it out for a while, and if that didn't work, then I could try another one. So if you're out there trying to write a story, whether it's a book or a movie or a song or anything like that, and you're running into problems where you're not sure how just like a little part of it's gonna go, I highly recommend pausing and coming back to that later. Just skip it. Just skip over it. Put in some sort of filler word that you will be able to recognize and come back to it later. There is no harm in not having that done until the end. Just don't forget to go back and fix it. I told you a little bit about my book, and now we're going to get into me reading the book to you. So I'm going to read the blurb on the back first, which is written sort of like a scene out of the book rather than a synopsis of what's going to happen in the story. So here is the blurb on the back. Through the darkness, the computer screen illuminated the pale skin of Adelaide's face around the black mask. Scrolling through the submitted questions, she came across one that made her smile. "Dear Lady Shade," she read aloud to herself. "Why did you choose to be a villain instead of a hero?" She chuckled, shaking her head at the simple, loaded question, before selecting it and opening the page to write a reply. "Hello, blogger KittyStan41. I bet you're expecting the classic, tragic backstory in response to this question," she typed. "Dead parents, treated like trash as a kid, and it all came to a choice between rising to defeat my inner demons or succumbing to them. Well, my real answer is possibly something you haven't considered about the world of heroes and villains. Answer this for me. What is the goal of a hero? To make the world a better place, perhaps? No, dear KittyStan41. The classic goals of the hero might seem epic and noble, but in the end, it all comes down to stopping the villain. What kind of life is that, when your only goals derive from the actions of someone else? Your whole life is used up as a preventative measure. Now, does that sound like a good way to live? I chose to be a villain not because I enjoy hurting people, but because I have goals that I plan to achieve. Don't bother asking what they are. If I told you, everyone would know, and then people, baby heroes mostly, would get in the way. Then how would I achieve them? I aspire to more. Is there a need for a better reason? That kind of gets into what I was talking about earlier, where heroes and villains just have widely contrasting things they get to do in the world. The agenda of heroes is often based on that of the agenda of villains. As a person who doesn't really want someone else to tell me what goals I should reach in life or what I can and can't do, I liked the idea of characters who get to go after their own thing. Now, as a disclaimer, my story did end up following more of the trope about a hero. I don't know if that's avoidable. Maybe I'll do better if I do a rewrite, but we'll see. And now for the prologue. This is the insight into the world of Adelaide Newman, my main character. Whispering winds danced across the gutters and the faces of brick buildings. The honking of car horns blended with the sound of chirping birds and crickets in the park 2 blocks over. Music blared from a block away, distorted across the wind. The sounds drifted in and out of earshot with the gusts from such a height. The aroma of wet cardboard and greasy grilled onions, and water poured over concrete near a construction site. Never had Adelaide fallen more in love with the city, nor had been more comfortable with its pulse. More at home with the movements of its people and their day-to-day lives. Especially compared to some of the places that she'd lived before. Dirty towns with unsafe streets where nearly every person that cried for help held only ill will towards their rescuer. They had been both intriguing in the girth of possibility and absolutely hopeless when it came to organization or reformation. Truly, this beautiful and chaotic city needed her as much as she needed it. So much had changed for this city in the 3 years since her arrival. So many possibilities had been explored and exploited. So many tiny corrections had turned this previously well-off city into the thriving market for nightlife she chose to associate herself with. Decidian was known as ground zero for the origins of the hero versus villain conflicts. 20 years ago, the streets had run rampant with murderous thieves and all sorts of criminals. The city had played a key role in the process of normalizing the idea that there would always be criminals, and there would always be those who try to stop them. Instead of constant battle, however, a few choice villains rose from the ranks and maintained their places over the city. Strangely, none of them wanted to enslave the people. In fact, they didn't care what the regular people did, leaving everyday life relatively uninterrupted. There were some citizens who even supported the goals and ideals of the villains. After a decade and a half of the rise and fall of this villain or that hero, It became obvious that the most successful operatives were those who benefited the city in some way, through the crimes, as people normalized the behavior and heroes were far less tempted to stop them. The reported crime rate of Decidian had dropped drastically in the last 5 years, changing from a wide range of messy, cruel games to an arena of endeavors for criminal activity, which now fell under exactly 3 categories. The regulation of such activities had become strategic. The northern half of the city, with its skyscrapers, piers, and abandoned structures, played host to the elaborate drug trade. Only one man could grant permission for any product movement within his boundaries. Their contraband ranged from that which was intended for recreational use to the top-secret formula for biomedically engineered substances that could increase one's lifespan or cure one's ailments for a price. All of the growth in both the lives of the common folks and those of the crew were at the behest of the pharmacist. The southern half, where the hostile divide between the old money rich and the devastatingly poor had grown steadily from a fissure to a chasm in the last decade, made up the territory for the second of the 3 criminal organizations. Playing host to the militia for the last few years, it had become a place where the young and the hopeless entered with little meat on their bones and minimal ability, and exited as trained warriors working for the marshal. The third category skipped back and forth between the 2 halves of the city, as the woman who ran the only heist operations permitted had worked out a system that benefited each of them. Lady Shade, the alternative identity of Adelaide, maintained a couple of cronies at any given time, and with her long history of successful bank robbing and her network of people with skills in money laundering, it would have been foolish for the other 2 to make enemies of her, especially because she'd gotten her hands in the pockets of the police force when she'd married the mayor. Her gloved fingers gripped the concrete ledge of the rooftop perch, and she leaned out over the streets below, taking it in for another moment before turning around to go home for the evening. And there you have it. That is the prologue of my book. What do you think? Who is Adelaide Newman? Who is the mysterious mayor that she's apparently married to? Who are the other 5 villains? What else do you want to know about the book? Drop your questions below. We'll just see if they get answered over time. Thank you so much for tuning in. I'm glad you're here. Thanks for showing up. Tune in next week for the beginnings of the D&D talks, where I will tell you all about my love of D&D, which I kind of introed in my intro. If you like what you see, go ahead and hit that subscribe button below so that you get updated when I update you. Thanks for showing up, and I'll see you next week. Welcome back to, gosh, that kind of gets into what I was talking about earlier. Her gloved fingers wow. Who are the other 6 villains? 5 villains? Lady Shade, the alternative identity.